Welcome, everyone. Lovely to have you here again for this fourth in the series of 5 talks on heroic journeys, specifically focused on Black histories on screen. So today I'm talking about True Justice, a documentary. The subtitle of the documentary is Bryan Stevenson's Fight for Equality. Released in 2019, HBO, 1 hour and 42 minutes. I hope you've had a chance to see it, and if you haven't, please do, because it's a really fine documentary about an extraordinary human being. True Justice, just use the short title, won the Peabody Award in 2020 given for outstanding public service through media. Particularly, as the executive director of the Peabody Award puts it, this is ultimately a place for storytelling through broadcasting and digital media. The Peabody Awards exist to recognize when storytelling is done well, when stories matter. And I'm going to be talking about why stories matter, how narrative works, and so on. So this documentary, True Justice, is a production of Kunhardt Production, an independent niche filmmaking company. They have made feature-length documentaries, I should say, for HBO, PBS, and American network specials. So you can see the niche production right there. So television medium is, in other words, a distribution platform, particularly HBO as the distribution platform for very self-selecting viewers and audiences. These are not films that you tend to see in your mainstream cinemas. So the Kunhardt documentary, production documentaries, they focus on public figures. And I like the way the kinds of figures has been described in an article. Warriors educating and informing the world of earnest messages that need to be heard. In other words, heroic figures with social purpose. And specifically, distinguished Americans. And I'm going to list 4 titles here for the documentaries that the Kunhardt Production Company has made. John McCain, For Whom the Bell Tolls, 2018. King in the Wilderness, 2018, The Final Years of Martin Luther King Jr. The Newspaper Man, The Life and Times of Ben Bradley, 2017. And many of you will know that Ben Bradley was a longtime editor of the Washington Post. And also a television series from 2013 to 2014 titled Women Who Made American. So the documentary True Justice is concerned with Bryan Stevenson's fight for equality, as the subtitle indicates. Director Peter Kunhardt, who works with his 2 sons, they are producers, has said this: moral leadership is a kind of trait that makes for good storytelling, and resonates with audiences. That was certainly a criterion that Bryan met. Now, Kunhardt was inspired by Bryan Stevenson's TED Talk in 2012. So I'm going to talk about, just for a moment, the TED Talk, March 5th, 2012, 23 minutes. Beaming from California, Stevenson was age 52 then. Stevenson is charismatic on stage, before cameras, before audience, at ease with himself. The premise for this TED Talk is identity. In his words, identity is really important. I learned a lot about identity from my grandmother, the family matriarch born in the 1880s. Black identity. He talks about the threat of terror that shaped our lives, shaped by a system of incarceration, as he put it, distorted by race and color, and driven by politics of fear. He concluded his talk by saying, we don't like to talk about our history. And I like this very much. coming from him because I think it's riveting. It really points to what he's about. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Very poetic, metaphoric morality tale, in other words. So you're seeing an image now on the screen of a book cover. It's a book by Stevenson that recounts his work, published in 2014. It's been described by a New York Times reviewer, Ted Conover, as a memoir that aggregates and personalizes the struggle against injustice in the story of one activist lawyer. Of course, Hollywood came along and adapted the book into a feature film called Just Mercy. The director is Dustin Daniel Cretton, 2019. They turned Stevenson's story into a bio-crime drama starring Jamie Foxx as one of his clients and Michael B. Jordan as playing the role of Stevenson, and also Brie Larson is in the film. She was a key figure in the justice mission in Montgomery, Alabama. Stevenson, interestingly, was one of several producers of this Hollywood version. Not sure why, but anyway, he was. But I think partly it's because he really is devoted to getting his message out. All right, my focus for this talk is True Justice, the documentary, Bryan Stevenson's fight for equality. All right, in this production, the Kunhardt production documentary, Stevenson is the documentary subject, an American lawyer, a social justice advocate for over 30 years, a Black man fighting in courts for prisoner rights. It's a moral and a legal journey that he's on, and it follows a very high moral ground. The man we see and hear on screen is a person of personal integrity and character, charismatic, an agile speaker, and also understated often. Locally based in Montgomery, Alabama, and also a Black lawyer in the national spotlight when he appears and has appeared several times and won landmark cases at the Supreme Court in Washington. Stephen has said elsewhere in an interview, it's about the client, it's about the issues, and it's certainly not about me. Now, of course, he's talking about this documentary. So the film does trace the scope of Stevenson's mission, the inequality of the justice system. But the film is also about Stevenson, the person, candid, open about his personal history, absorbed in playing the piano as he tells us, as viewers, to take his mind off his work. For me, he says, music is therapy. When I play, I'm not thinking of anything. One of the few times he isn't thinking of anything. So here Stevenson is, this amazing middle-aged man, 59 when this film was made, engaged with family, nieces, nephews, on a visit to Georgetown, Delaware for a family gathering. Content, it seems, to forego a family of his own. And he says in a narration voiceover, that's not a sacrifice. And we see a shot of him sitting alone in a pew in the family church back home, an African American Methodist church, a special formative place, he confides. So moments like this measure the person, but they're integral to the challenges of his mission and what he faces. Now, heroic figures are subject to comments and testimony of others. We see this in dramas, don't we? Other voices in the film talk about the lead character, so to speak. And people in this film talk about Stevenson. His sister on camera says, for the most part, he's on the go. A legal colleague, a woman, refers to his path as incredibly lonely. Think of that image of him long shot from the back, sitting alone in the old family church. These testimonies speak to a man in motion, often alone, filmed driving to court, to prison, to visit family. The camera documents glimpses of passing scenes from his car. In other words, his lens, his perception about these scenes. What are they? A lush plantation-style estate. Feels very old school, doesn't it? A facade of a courthouse. Professional legal places he's familiar with. And in voiceover, as we see these glimpses, he speaks to issues of racial hierarchy between white and black. The documentary also trains on a contemplative, thoughtful Stevenson, intellectually absorbed, walking the corridor of the Equal Justice Initiative Center that he started in Montgomery, Alabama. Past framed photos of black subjects, clients, cases he's fought, as if he's always among them, ever mindful of these lives at stake. So a motif emerges in the film of Stevenson as a memory keeper, acting out the art of never forgetting. It's an amazing thing, and I'm going to repeat it. A memory keeper, acting out the art of never forgetting. All right, so I'm going to talk about the prologue to the film now that I've established this premise. The documentary establishes this concept of never forgetting in the prologue. In the opening voiceover, Stevenson's mission as a journey, a shot of the Supreme Court building with a motto carved in stone, equal justice under law. This is a recurring reference, a recurring shot in the film structure, a shot of Stevenson driving, literally and figuratively on a journey, relating a childhood swimming pool anecdote. Such fun. Then I realized chaos had broken out. He's the only kid, the black kid, left in the pool, as the other kids have been yanked out by their parents. Lesson learned. What do you do with a memory like that? Memory, he says, is a powerful force. Superimposed imagery on screen, a photo of Bryan the boy, against a collage, archival images of slavery, a film edit to another sign, the Equal Justice Initiative building in Montgomery, linking childhood memory to his present-day legal mission. Then a moment of an in-house lecture, still in the prologue, relating Rosa Parks' story and legacy. She was more than on a bus boycott. She was protesting, as Stevenson says in this lecture, the arrest and criminal treatment of a black teenager. Stephen's audience at this lecture, nodding, transfixed, also remembering, never mind the hard folding seats, we've all been on those, and the tight physical space. That's the prologue. So the emphasis in the film structure returns several times to Stevenson's lecture, to this communicator before a mixed-race audience, listening, absorbing historical narrative he relates. I'm going to say that the lecture anchors the film. It anchors Stevenson's journey and his role in the Equal Justice Initiative as an institution dedicated to reform. And it's located just a few buildings away from where a slave market once operated. Every photo, every file represents aspects of this lifelong narrative conducted by him. Stephen's mission, then, as you can see, is bred in the bone of Black ancestry and history. The narrative memory of his grandfather fleeing north in the 1980s, along with, as he says, refugees from terror in American South, archival footage. How about this? Archival footage. Well, it is photos of belongings and refugees packed in the backs of trucks. Everything they have is there. The granddad was a murder victim in South Philadelphia, the place of freedom. Kids trying to steal his television set. Stevenson's grandparents were from Caroline County, Virginia. And that rings a bell for you from our last talk in our last film, The Loving Story. Caroline County, Virginia is the same rural county where Richard and Mildred Loving lived. So Stevenson processes such memory, noting kids live in violent neighborhoods. They attend violent schools. What else can we expect? This resonates in Stevenson's and the Equal Justice Initiative landmark case, Miller versus Alabama, in the Supreme Court, 2012. The court struck down statutes in 29 states that provide for mandatory life without parole sentences for children. In other words, death sentence of children replaced by death in prison reality. To put it more plainly, the death sentence may have been commuted, but you grow old in prison and you die there. Death in prison reality. What a horrendous thing. Stevenson is adept before the press and television cameras. He's objective and unequivocal. As he says, the innocent cases, as I've just described, are the most difficult. Recalling 1950s segregation in a states' rights case, Stevenson refers to himself as a product of segregated education. Repeatedly recalling the past, and also attending Harvard Law School, where he says he felt vulnerable. The things I've been silent about are the things that I should be talking about. So he has clear moral direction and precise diction of his legal arguments, stated and restated, retelling, correcting past narratives of incarceration, justice ignored, forgotten, deferred. There's a confessional element as well as a personal element to Stevenson's narrative in the film. And this is telling. I do what I do because I'm broken too. I'm part of the broken community. Sometimes I go to Dexter, to Dr. King's church. So Stevenson's moral compass is Martin Luther King Jr. I'm quoting him. The image that best captures his courage is his arm, that is Dr. King's arm, being held behind him, twisted, arrested for protesting. On screen, a photo of King being arrested, arm twisted behind him. Another photo appears of a random black man arrested, same technique, arm twisted behind him, a common practice. Now, heroes beget heroes, or at least heroic action. But acting heroically for anybody is fragile. It requires consolation and humility. And here I'm quoting Stevenson. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm 3 blocks from where Dr. King pastored his church. I'm 2 blocks from where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. I am surrounded by the spirits and souls of people who did extraordinary things. I'm standing on their shoulders, and they did so much more with so much less. I believe I'm required to carry that on, including naming the racist past, show trials of the past, where the state legally did what lynching had done. What an extraordinary thing. Director Peter Kunhardt has said elsewhere in an interview, "We took great care to show the gruesome realities of lynchings, but not to exploit those photographic images, often lingering longer on the site of whites reveling in the horrific events. We need to look at those harrowing photos, and we will, watching this film, because they reveal whites and kids as spectators at lynchings, robbing the dead for souvenirs, posing for photographs with lynched bodies, in other words, flaunting their supremacist pride. If, as viewers, we don't get crimes of injustice, Stevenson interprets the imagery and the dreadful imagery, the dreadful imaginary of the imagery, like a pointed storyteller, calling it terrorism in its most complete sense. Stevenson is the driving voice in the film. Extensive interviews with Stevenson thread the documentary. He speaks in a direct address to the camera, as I am speaking to this camera right now, to you as spectators. This is direct address. He is perfectly lit, as he should be, telling the story of the Equal Justice Initiative, a running, fluid narrative, delivering the message. You're going to see a photo now on screen of a photo of Stevenson, and I'm going to point out that just look at the background. You're going to see what you will also see in the subsequent photo. You're going to see jars of soil behind him. The photo of Stevenson with his background is taken from the HBO website. It was photographed by Nick Frontiero. All right, so those jars of soil, here they are, lined up in rows. These jars of soil were collected by kids on a field trip to lynching sites. Jars reverently placed in rows in the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. They become artifacts. They're labeled with names. They're there in perpetuity. Stevenson says, "When I see each jar, it tells its own story. It's not about mass. It's about individual black lives." He refers to the very variety of colors in the soil representing blood, geography, and individual lives. Now, Stevenson is not the lone compelling voice in the film, though he is the key. Anthony Ray Hinton's story and his presence is quite extraordinary. He's barbecuing for a family reunion. He had been on death row for several years when Stevenson took his case to the Supreme Court. Here is Stevenson speaking. 16 years went by, he says, 3 different attorneys. My life was not worth the truth. Stevenson points out the paradox when Hinton is released. A very happy day, he says. A tragic day, too, because Mr. Hinton was incarcerated for 30 years. In Hinton's word, and he's a compelling individual, he says, "No one in the state of Alabama had the decency to say, 'Mr. Hinton, I'm sorry.'" For Stevenson, Hinton represents how the broken can show us the power of redemption and justice. Now, Stevenson is the film's main talking head. I mean, that's a term that we use in documentary, telling his story, telling the narratives of injustice. He uses phrases like a new kind of enslavement, that is, these long incarcerations, as part of the legal architecture of court. He replaces the word slave with the word criminal. He talks about the prison system being monetized for profit motive. The more people incarcerated, the more money made. He talks about the tropes of law and order. We hear those all the time, don't we? In news, law and order from politicians. Getting tough on crime. How often have we heard that? He talks about the doctrine of inevitable. Let's try that again, Joe. The doctrine of inevitability, that is, the inevitability of the execution of Black people. So Stevenson is a new style orator for the age, speaking to and before audiences, speaking to the documentary camera, to us as viewers. My grandmother, he says, understood the power of narrative, in other words, of talking. He admits, I'd never met a lawyer until I got to law school. In court, he says, the client is often the only Black person in the room before a white jury. As viewers, our ears start to tune in to his interpretive language, to his crusading point of view. In an interview with Stevenson elsewhere in 2019, the interviewer says Stevenson's knack for galvanizing narratives is as evident in these facilities as it is when he speaks in public. In talks to large audiences, he dances fluidly between the measured intonation of a therapist and the soaring rhetorical fervor of a preacher. Well put. Stevenson's narrative mission is a corrective to generic television narratives. He refers to law and order type dramas. I'm quoting him. And we all see these dramas. Some of us really enjoy them. He says, we've created law and order type dramas where all the police officers are attractive and nice and thoughtful and conflicted. And we've created narratives about judges where they're presented as always very balanced and sincere. Those narratives have given confidence to a lot of people about the criminal justice system that is not well earned. I see it in my life. I see it in my practice. A system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor or innocent. That's a reality I don't think we've done well portraying in the media. So telling. Think about that next time you watch Law and Order. I think it's coming back for another season. If not, there are many repeats. All right, I'm near the end of this talk. In the next few minutes, as I wrap it up, you're going to see a series of images. They are free under the Creative Commons measure. So here we are. The film ends with these extraordinary images of two sites representing truth and reconciliation. And this is a kind of destination, so to speak, a philosophical destination for Stevenson, truth and reconciliation. These two sites are destination sites in Montgomery, Alabama. In Stevenson's word, they're the result of an effort to build a memorial in the one instance and to build a narrative museum. And here you see the narrative museum on screen. The legacy museum called the Narrative Museum, concerned with racial inequality with America. At the opening of the Legacy Museum, the Narrative Museum, Stevenson gestures to phases of Black history represented there. Guess who's present? Anthony Ray Hinton. Remember him? A former client, a friend. His story is part of the museum's narrative. And here you're seeing a photo of the displays within the Narrative Museum. Photos of a brick wall. Read what it says. So important. Before a capacity audience, Stephen is the person, the voice at the mic. He has a plea. help us make it a movement. Again, he's drawing on that 1960s notion of the movement, the Martin Luther King movement. As we try to create a better America, a repair for us all. That's what truth and reconciliation is, a repair. Now you're going to see two photos here now of the National Memorial for Peace and for Justice. The camera pans the evocative spaces, and there's Stevenson still on the move in the documentary, walking among the steel monuments of a racist past. These are not figurative images we see suspended that document lynching history. They are bodies of steel with names on them. There's a fade out as the film ends, an overhead shot, I should say, of the Legacy Museum. And the text on screen says, within the first year of opening, nearly 400,000 people have visited the Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. There's also text on screen over other steel monuments waiting to be claimed. The text reads, so far, over 300 counties have expressed their desire to claim these monuments from the memorial. The idea is to place these different monuments in the different communities, a recognition of injustice. On the soundtrack, what do we hear? A band with a wonderful name of Sweet Honey on the Rock. They're singing We'll Never Turn Back. I want to end with this idea. The documentary film is shaped by cinematic devices. We see that. Narrative devices. We see that. Documentaries are driven by social purpose. As John Grierson, who coined the term documentary back in the 1920s, said, documentary is the creative treatment of actuality, and this film is too. I want to end with quotes from two independent American documentary filmmakers from 2020. The first comes from Robert Greene. He says, one thing people don't usually understand about what we do, documentary filmmakers, is just how complex it is to make films with real human beings, our so-called subjects, who ultimately remain the folks we're most indebted to. And this from another independent documentary filmmaker speaking in 2020, Cecilia Aldemondo. What separates us from fiction filmmakers is that deep ethical bind to others, the subjects of the films, the actual people. So this is a film about an extraordinary man, about an extraordinary mission, and please see it if you haven't. So that's it for my talk tonight, and I just want to remind you that 2 weeks from now, on Thursday, November 19th, will be the last talk that I will be doing in this series. The focus will be on the feature film Harriet. And you all know, or many of you will know what that film is about and who Harriet is. Until next time, good night from the museum.